My dad told me to go live in the streets, and then he turned off the porch light. I was 24. I stood on the steps of the house I grew up in, one canvas bag in my hand, listening to the deadbolt slide home behind me. Rain was coming down sideways. "No daughter of mine throws her future in the dirt," he'd said. My mom watched from the window and did nothing. My sister smiled. They were all so sure they knew exactly who I was. The useless one, the failure, the embarrassment of the Faulkner name. They spent the next 10 years telling that story to anyone in Hartwell who would listen. But here's what none of them knew about those 10 years, and what I did 3 weeks after my father finally called me again, not knowing who he was really calling. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit with the quiet women who got underestimated, and we stay for the moment the whole room finally goes silent. If a story ever feels like it could be your own, that's exactly why you're here, and you're not alone in it. So settle in, drop a comment if this one hits home, and be sure to subscribe. Let me take you back to the dinner that started all of it. I was 24 and 3 weeks out of graduate school, which is a polite way of saying I had just walked away from it. I'd been studying to become an architect, the respectable, framed diploma kind my parents could brag about at church. Then a contractor I'd interned with offered me a beat-up Victorian and a question. Could I bring it back to life and sell it? I said yes, before he finished asking. I saw the whole thing in my head, room by room, like the house was already telling me what it wanted to be. To my father, I had thrown away a future for a pile of rotted siding. He said it at the dinner table, fork down, voice flat. "You had a real path. Now you want to dig in the dirt like a day laborer." My mother nodded along, the way she always did. Across the table sat Vanessa, my older sister, the one with the law school plans and the Pruitt engagement ring, glowing like she'd been told to. "Not everyone's built for ambition, Addie," she said, soft as a knife. I didn't argue. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with my family was like pushing on a locked door. What none of them understood was that I hadn't quit anything. I had finally seen something they couldn't. The question wasn't whether I would fail. The question was why they were all so desperate for me too. You have to understand what the Faulkner name meant in Hartwell. My father, Gerald, was the man who developed half the new streets on the east side. The strip mall, the office park, the gated cul-de-sac with the fountain nobody asked for. Those were his. People shook his hand at the diner. The house we lived in had a circular driveway and a chandelier in the foyer. My mother dusted herself so the cleaning lady wouldn't chip it. Carol Faulkner had spent 30 years building the appearance of a woman who had married well, and she defended that appearance like it was the last room in a burning building. My parents threw dinner parties where the wine was expensive and the conversation was a performance. That spring there was one for Vanessa's engagement, the backyard strung with lights, a band, a tent. I remember standing near the bar when the house phone rang and my father stepped away to take it. I was close enough to hear the tone, not the words. Whoever was on the line was not calling to congratulate anyone. My father's jaw went tight, his knuckles white around the receiver, and then he laughed too loudly and said, "We'll square it Monday, no trouble at all." He hung up, fixed his smile back on, and walked into the lights like nothing had happened. I was the only one watching. At 24, I filed it away as none of my business. I had no idea I had just heard the first crack in a foundation that had been quietly rotting for years. The night they put me out came 2 weeks later. I'd signed the papers on the Victorian. I'd used the small inheritance my grandmother slipped me, and a loan I'd talked a credit union into. And I had told my parents because I was foolish enough to think they might, for once, be proud. My father stood up from his chair so fast it scraped the floor. "You took out a loan? Against what? Your good name?" He said the Faulkner name didn't beg for scraps. He said I was making the family a joke. And then he said the thing I would carry for 10 years. "If you want to live like you've got nothing, then go. Go live in the streets." I waited for my mother to speak. She had a way of smoothing things, of pulling him back from the edge. She opened her mouth. She even reached toward the hallway table where I would later learn she'd tucked an envelope of cash, her own quiet apology. My father saw her hand move and said her name once, Sharp, and she stopped. The envelope stayed where it was. I packed one bag. The rain had started. I stepped onto the porch, and behind me I heard the deadbolt. And then the porch light went dark, and I stood there in the wet dark of the only home I'd ever known, locked out of it. I did not cry on those steps. I'm not telling you that to sound strong. I'm telling you because something in me had already gone very calm, the way a house goes quiet right before you finally start tearing out everything that was rotten. Vanessa followed me out to the gate. For one stupid second, I thought she'd come to stop me. She'd come to make sure I left. "Don't make a scene at the wedding," she said, arms crossed against the cold. "Mom's already stressed." I told her I hadn't been invited to make a scene anywhere. That's when she said it, the line that would echo in my head for a decade. "You're not a real Faulkner. Real Faulkners don't dig in the dirt." She said it the way you'd state the weather. Then she turned to go back inside. And here's the part she didn't know I saw. She stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up at that big bright house with something that wasn't triumph at all. It was fear. Her shoulders were up around her ears. She glanced back at the lit windows like a woman checking whether the floor under her was still there. At the time, I didn't understand it. I was too busy being thrown away to notice that my perfect sister was holding on to her place with both hands and white knuckles. Later, I'd understand it completely. Vanessa wasn't cruel because she was strong. She was cruel because she was terrified of being where I was standing. She had married the Pruitt name and the Pruitt lifestyle, and she had no idea yet how thin the ice under all of it really was. I got in my car. I drove 2 hours through the rain to a city called Calderon, where I knew exactly one person and owned exactly one rotted Victorian, and I started. For the first 8 months, I slept in the workshop behind the Victorian on a cot, with a space heater and my grandmother's old quilt. I learned to do the work with my own hands so I'd know when a crew was lying to me. I framed, I sanded, I priced lumber until I dreamed in board feet. The Victorian sold for almost double what I'd paid, and the credit union loved me after that. I took the profit and bought 2 more houses, then 4. But the thing that changed everything wasn't a house. It was a woman named Ruth. She hired me to make her late husband's home livable so she could stay in it instead of going to a facility she couldn't afford and didn't want. She was 81, sharp as a tack, and she reminded me so much of my grandmother that I almost cried in her kitchen. While I widened her doorways and lowered her counters, Ruth told me about her friends, all of them facing the same impossible math. Too much house, too little money, and nowhere decent to go. That was the night the real idea arrived. Not flipping houses, building places where people like Ruth, like my grandmother, could live with dignity and not go broke doing it. Affordable senior housing, restored and run right. I wrote it on the back of a paint can label and pinned it over the cot. I didn't know yet that the company I'd build on that idea would one day be worth more than everything my father ever developed. I just knew, standing in Ruth's kitchen, that I had finally found the thing worth digging in the dirt for. There was exactly one person in my family who called me that first year. My grandmother, Marenne. My mother's mother, 84 then, with a voice like gravel and gospel. She called every Sunday. She never once asked me to come home, never once told me to apologize to my father. She just asked what I was building. When I told her about Ruth, about the idea, she went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Build something that keeps people warm, Addie. That's the only kind of rich that holds." A week later, an envelope arrived with $2,000 in it, her own savings, in 10s and 20s that smelled like her purse. I called to refuse it. She told me not to insult her. So I kept that envelope in a drawer and didn't spend a dollar of it for over a year, because some money isn't for spending. It's for remembering whose hands it came from. On one of those Sunday calls, near the end of the year, she said something I didn't think much about then. "The land my daddy left me," she said. "The 40 acres out past Hartwell. That's going where it belongs. I've seen to it." in writing. I told her not to talk like she was going anywhere. She laughed her gravel laugh and changed the subject. I should have listened harder, because that piece of land, and the letter she sealed in a steel box, would turn out to be the hinge the whole thing swung on. But that was years away. Back then, it was just my grandmother's voice on a Sunday, telling me to keep people warm. I kept my grandmother's $2,000 in that drawer for a full year before I understood why. Some of you already know exactly why. If a quiet promise to yourself ever carried you through a hard season, tell me about it down in the comments. And stay with me, because Hartwell was not done with me yet. 4 years passed. Faulkner and Vale Restoration. Vale was Ruth's late husband's name, and I put it on the door because she cried when I asked. Had 30 employees and a waiting list. We'd opened 2 senior communities and broken ground on a third. And I did something on purpose that most people found strange. I stayed invisible. No social media. No newspaper profiles. No mention of my last name where it might travel the 2 hours back to Hartwell. I told myself it was humility. The truth was harder. I didn't want my father to be proud of money. I wanted him to have been wrong about me. And there's a difference. And the difference is the whole story. So I built in the quiet. The only loose thread from my old life was a bank account. A joint checking account my parents had opened for me when I left for college. The one they'd insisted on so they could help in an emergency. The statement still went to my parents' house in Hartwell. I'd never changed the address of record because I never used the thing. I made one small automatic deposit into it out of habit, a holdover I kept meaning to close, and otherwise it sat off in a corner of my life where I never looked. I told myself I'd handle it eventually. That account, the one I forgot to worry about, the one whose statements I never saw, was the door I had left unlocked, and someone in my family had noticed it long before I did. My accountant found it on an ordinary Tuesday. Her name was Priya. She had just taken over my full books to consolidate every account under the company, and she was the kind of careful that makes you sleep at night. Pulling everything into one place, she turned up the old college account I'd forgotten, slid a printout across my desk, and tapped a column. "These withdrawals," she said, "they've been going on for years. Small enough not to flag. Steady. And whoever's doing it has online access, all above board on paper." I looked at the dates. They went back almost 6 years. A few $100 here, 1,000 there, drawn from that old college account I'd never closed. My stomach dropped, then went cold. I asked who. Priya had already pulled the records. The transfers were authorized by a name listed as a secondary user from way back, a name I had not put there and had not thought about in a decade. Trevor Pruitt, my sister's husband. I sat with that for a long minute. Trevor, who managed money for half of Hartwell's so-called important people. Trevor, who had access to that account because at some point my father had added his son-in-law as a convenience and never told me. The total, over 6 years, was just past $40,000. It wasn't the amount that turned my hands to ice. It was the patience of it. Someone had been reaching into my life a little at a time, careful never to take enough to notice, betting that the useless failure would never look closely at anything. I asked Priya the only question that mattered right then. Where was the money going? She shook her head. That's the part I can't see from here. So now I had a thread to pull, and pulling it would take me back to the one place I'd sworn I'd never drive to again. My first move was the obvious one: close the account. I called the bank that afternoon, ready to be done with it in 5 minutes. It was not 5 minutes. The woman on the phone was polite and immovable. The account had been opened as a joint account when I was a dependent, under one of those old agreements my parents had insisted on, with a clause buried in the terms that said any closure required every owner to authorize it in writing. It listed 2 primary owners, me and my father, Gerald Faulkner. To close it, the bank needed both signatures, both of us, in person or notarized. I asked if I could at least freeze it, remove the secondary user, stop the bleeding. I could file a request, she said, but a joint owner could dispute it, and while it was disputed, the account stayed open. I hung up and sat very still. Here is what I want you to understand, because it matters. I was not a woman who trusted blindly. I had spotted the problem. I had moved to shut it down the same day. I had done everything a careful person does. And it didn't matter. I was trapped by a piece of paper I'd signed at 18, a structure I couldn't dismantle alone, because the man bleeding me was legally tied to the very thing I needed to close. To get my own name free, I needed my father's signature, the father who threw me into the rain. I could have called him. I could have driven down and demanded it. But something told me that the moment I tipped my hand, the withdrawals would stop. The trail would go cold, and I'd never learn the answer to Priya's question. Where was the money going? So I did the hardest thing for a person like me. I waited, and I watched. I drove the 2 hours back to Hartwell on a gray Saturday, the first time in years. The town looked the same and smaller, the way the places that hurt you always do. I didn't go to the house. I went to the diner, sat in a back booth, and just listened. Because in a town like Hartwell, the diner is the newspaper. It didn't take long to hear my own name. 2 women in the next booth were talking about the Faulkners, and one of them lowered her voice the way people do right before they're cruel. And the younger one, Adeline, living off the state somewhere, I heard. Such a shame. Gerald and Carol did everything for that girl. I held my coffee and felt the heat of it in my hands and said nothing. So that was the story they'd been telling. Not that I left. That I failed. That I was a drain, a disappointment, a cautionary tale. They had spent 10 years building a version of me out of lies, and the whole town had moved into it. On my way out, I saw the billboards. You couldn't miss them. Faulkner Grand Vista, luxury living comes to Hartwell. My father's face, airbrushed 10 years younger, smiling over an artist's rendering of glass towers that did not belong in a town this size. A grand new development, his biggest ever. I stood on the sidewalk looking up at that smiling billboard, and a quiet question started forming in the back of my mind. Where does a man in a town this small get the money for towers like that? I had a feeling I already knew where some of it had come from. The answer came from an old contractor named Sal, who'd worked my father's sites for 20 years and gotten stiffed on the last one. I found him at the hardware store and bought him a coffee, and once a man like Sal starts talking, the dam doesn't hold. Grand Vista, he told me, was in trouble. Deep trouble. My father had sunk everything into it and then gone looking for more. And here was the part that made my coffee taste like rust. Gerald had been raising money around town, taking investments from neighbors, from the church building fund, from retirees who handed over their savings because Gerald Faulkner's handshake had always been good in Hartwell. Ruth's whole world, the people I'd built my entire company to protect, except these were my father's neighbors, and he was using their nest eggs to prop up his glass towers. Project's bleeding, Sal said. He's robbing Peter to pay Paul and running out of Peters. That was when it clicked into place, cold and complete. The withdrawals from my account weren't greed for its own sake. They were a patch. $40,000, drawn out a little at a time, plugging holes in a sinking development. My money, taken without a word, was helping keep my father's lie afloat while he told the whole town I was the failure. I drove home that night, back to Calderon, my actual home, 2 hours north, gripping the wheel the whole way. I wasn't angry, exactly. Anger is hot and fast and stupid. What I felt was something slower and far more useful. I had spent 10 years building. Now, for the first time, I started thinking about what I could build that would bring the whole rotten thing down. 2 days later, a lawyer called. Not mine. A man named Hollis who said he'd handled my grandmother's affairs and that Marin had left instructions for a sealed box to be delivered to me alone, 2 years after her passing. Not money, he said. Papers she'd arranged long before she died. The timing of the handoff had been her choice. I drove to his office not knowing what to expect. He gave me a steel lockbox, scuffed at the corners, with my grandmother's handwriting on a tag tied to the handle. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter. The second was a folded legal document, and when I opened it, my breath caught. It was a deed. Years back, Marin had signed the 40 acres past Hartwell over to me, outright, in my name, and had it recorded at the county office at the time, quietly, so the land had been legally mine for years already, long before that morning in Hollis's office. The same 40 acres my father had been treating as Faulkner land his whole life. The letter explained the rest in her gravel and gospel voice. She wrote that she'd watched Gerald borrow against things that weren't his, watched him mistake a smile for a foundation. She wrote that she'd moved the land out of the old family trust and into my name alone years earlier, and recorded the transfer without telling a soul, because, she said, "You are the only one who builds instead of borrows." The box and the weight had only ever been about when I learned of it, not when it became mine. And then, the line I have never forgotten, the one I keep folded in my wallet to this day. The land was never his to borrow against. Grandma made sure of that. In writing, in ink, with my name on it. I sat in that office holding 60-year-old paper, and the whole map of the thing rearranged itself in my mind. If Gran Vista was as deep in trouble as Sal said, my father had almost certainly pledged everything he could get his hands on as collateral, including, I would bet my company on it. The 40 acres he believed were his, 40 acres that by law belonged to me. A lesser version of me would have driven to Hartwell that night and ended it with one phone call. I didn't. I called my lawyers instead, the good ones, and I asked them to teach me exactly how a development like Grand Vista dies. They walked me through it. When a project like my father's runs out of road, the bank that holds its biggest loan doesn't just forgive it. The bank wants out. So it sells the debt, packages up what it's owed and sells it, often at a steep discount, to whoever will take the risk of collecting. Distressed debt, they called it. Whoever buys that debt steps into the bank's shoes. They hold the note. They hold the collateral. They hold, in the plainest terms, the man's whole project in the palm of their hand. I asked the question slowly, to be sure I understood. So if I bought the debt, legally, in a fair sale, I would own my father's leverage over himself? In effect, my lawyer said, you'd own his project's fate, and anything pledged against it, including the 40 acres he'd pledged that weren't his, including the lie. I felt something settle in my chest, quiet and certain. I wasn't going to scream at my father. Screaming was his weapon, and I had watched it my whole life. I was going to do the patient thing, the built thing. I was going to wait for Gran Vista to reach the edge, and then, with my name on every piece of paper, I was going to step in and decide what happened next. Not as the useless daughter begging back in, as the only person in the room who actually held the keys. I could have called my father that night and ended it with one sentence. I didn't. Some doors you don't kick down. You wait until you hold the key, legally, with your name on the paper. If you've ever chosen patience over a scream, you already understand what came next. I set up a quiet acquisition vehicle, a small holding company 2 layers removed from my name, and I had my people watch the Grand Vista loan like hawks waiting for it to fall. It fell faster than I expected. Within weeks, the bank moved to offload the note. But before I could close, I learned I wasn't the only one circling. Someone else had approached the bank about the Grand Vista debt, through a broker, discreetly, the same way I had. It took my team 11 days to learn who. Trevor Pruitt, my sister's husband, the man who'd been quietly draining my account for 6 years, was now trying to buy up my father's debt out from under him. He wasn't trying to save Gerald. He was trying to take Gran Vista for himself, to swallow whatever was left, and leave his own father-in-law holding the wreckage. I almost laughed. The family that called me a failure was, underneath the chandelier and the billboards, a nest of people quietly robbing each other. Trevor didn't know I existed in this. He thought he was bidding against some faceless investor. He had no idea the faceless investor was the sister-in-law he'd been stealing from for 6 years. I told my lawyers one thing: whatever it takes, we win the debt. Then I sat back and let two people who had spent a decade underestimating me bid against the very thing they'd thrown away. Grand Vista started missing deadlines the whole town could see. The cranes stopped moving. The model unit's lights went dark. And in Hartwell, when a project stalls, the people who put their savings into it start to panic. I heard it through Sal, then through Ruth's network, which somehow stretched all the way down to Hartwell. Retirees talk to retirees. An elderly couple who'd invested their entire retirement were calling my father's office and getting no answer. A widow from the church was telling anyone who'd listen that Gerald had promised her 10% and she couldn't reach him. My father's response to a town starting to doubt him was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd built his whole life on appearances. He threw an event. A fundraiser, he called it. A Save Grand Vista Gala at the Hartwell Community Hall, where he would reassure his investors that everything was fine, that a major partner was about to step in and rescue the project, that their money was safe. He sent gilded invitations to the whole town. Vanessa was helping him plan it, of course, smiling for the cameras, the perfect daughter shoring up the perfect family. I imagine she said something like it to one of the investors, the line she'd built her life on. Real Faulkners take care of their own. I read about the gala in an online notice and felt the pieces locked together. My father was going to stand in front of the whole town and promise that a mysterious savior was coming to rescue Grand Vista. He was right that someone was coming. He just had no idea who. The sale closed on a Thursday morning. I was in my office in Calderon when my lawyer called to say it was done. We had won the Grand Vista note, outbid Trevor's broker by a margin that wasn't even close, because Trevor was gambling with money he'd skimmed, and I was building with money I'd earned. Distressed debt never trades for what it says on paper. The bank wanted out so badly it let the note go for a fraction of its face value, and 10 years of running a $15 million company had left me with the reserves and the credit line to cover that fraction without losing sleep. My holding company now owned my father's largest loan and every asset pledged against it. And there, in the collateral schedule, in black and white, was the line I'd been waiting for. 40 acres past Hartwell, pledged by Gerald Faulkner as security. The same 40 acres that, by a deed in my grandmother's careful hand, had belonged to me the entire time. My father had borrowed millions against land he didn't own. He'd pledged it as Faulkner family land, the way he pledged everything, and the lender's title work on a rushed refinance had leaned on the old trust records and never caught my grandmother's quiet transfer. It wasn't fraud I had to prove in some long, ugly trial. It was simpler and cleaner than that. A recorded deed beats a sloppy title search every time. The collateral was void. The pledge was air. Which meant the bank's loan, now my loan, had been propped up on a foundation that didn't exist. And I was the one who'd known it all along. I sat there holding the closing documents and thought about the porch light going dark. I thought about the deadbolt. I thought about 10 years of being the family failure while these people quietly stripped everything they could from anyone within reach, including me, including their own neighbors. I had the note. I had the deed. I had the truth. The only thing left to decide was where to set it all down, and I knew exactly where. In 3 days, the whole town would be in one room, waiting for my father to introduce his mystery savior. I bought a plain dark dress and had my lawyer print 3 copies of everything. 2 days before the gala, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 10 years. Vanessa. I let it ring twice, then answered. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask how I was. My perfect sister, after a decade of silence, called to ask me for money. I know things got weird between us, she said, breezy, like we'd missed a brunch. But you're family, and family helps family. Trevor and I just hit a rough patch. Cash flow. I figured you might have a little saved up from your projects. The condescension in that pause could have stripped paint. I asked her carefully, what kind of rough patch? And here is where Vanessa, who had never once imagined I might be paying attention, told me something she didn't know she was telling. She started complaining about Trevor, how he'd been moving family money around for years to keep them afloat, how she'd assumed it was all above board. Some account Dad set up. Savings. Whatever. She said it like it was nothing. Like the $40,000 siphoned out of my life was just loose change in a family drawer she was entitled to. So Vanessa thought the money Trevor stole from me was the family's to spend. She had been living on it. The dinners, the clothes, the appearances, without ever knowing or caring where it came from. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She was a woman who'd been handed a script at birth and was now realizing the show had no money behind it. I told her I'd think about the loan. I had no intention of giving her a dime, but I let her believe I might, because in 2 days she was going to be in that hall, and I wanted the whole family in the room. The night before the gala, my mother called. That surprised me more than Vanessa had. Carol Faulkner did not make phone calls that might turn into feelings, but her voice, when I answered, was not the smooth hostess voice I'd grown up under. It was thin and uneven, an old woman's voice. "I don't know why I'm calling," she said. And then, slowly, she told me about the night they put me out. She told me she'd had an envelope of her own money in the hall table, that she'd meant to press it into my hand at the door, that she'd reached for it. "Your father said my name," she said. "Just my name." And I stopped. I've thought about that envelope every day for 10 years. I waited. I had learned to wait. I thought maybe, finally, this was the apology, the crack in the wall. But my mother was who she had always been. After the silence, she gathered herself, and the hostess came back into her voice, and she said, "Your father did what he thought was right. He always has. You have to understand the position he was in." And there it was. Even now, even bleeding the truth out at last, she could not say he was wrong. She had spent her whole life defending the appearance of him, and she could not stop. Not even for me, not even on the phone in the dark. I told her I appreciated the call. I meant it. It cost her something to make it. But I want to be honest with you about what it didn't do. It didn't change a single thing about what I was going to do tomorrow. Some people will hand you the truth and still stand on the wrong side of it. My mother was one of them. I want to tell you what I decided that last night, because it's the part I'm proudest of, and it's the part that almost no one expects. I was not going to Hartwell to destroy my father. I could have. I held everything I needed to leave him with nothing, to call the loan, take the land, let Grand Vista collapse with all those people's savings inside it, and walk away while the Faulkner name burned. That would have been revenge. It would also have meant Ruth's kind of people, the retirees and the widow from the church, lost everything in the fire. And those were exactly the people I had spent 10 years learning to protect. So I made a different plan. I prepared 2 things for that haul. The first was a single folder, the deed and the note and the proof. The truth laid out so plainly that no amount of my father's shouting could bury it. The second was something my father would never have thought to bring to his own gala. A real plan to make the investors whole, a restructuring, my company stepping in not to seize but to stabilize, every retiree paid back on a schedule I could actually keep. I wasn't going to take the house out from under my parents. I was going to take the lie out from under all of it, in front of everyone. And then I was going to do the thing none of them had ever done for me. I was going to make it right. I packed the folder. I laid out the plain dark dress, and I thought about the deadbolt one more time, and how funny it was that the only Faulkner who ever learned to build was the one they threw into the street. The Hartwell Community Hall was strung with the same kind of lights my parents always used, the warm ones that make everything look like money. I walked in 5 minutes after it started, in my plain dark dress, and the room turned to look at me the way a town does when the local cautionary tale walks through the door. I heard the murmur travel. "That's Adeline. The failure. What's she doing here?" I found my parents near the front. My father saw me, and his face did something I'll remember forever. Surprise, then contempt, then the smooth public mask sliding back down. He crossed to me fast, took my elbow, lowered his voice to the hiss he used when he didn't want a scene. "You don't belong here. This is for investors, for family." I looked at him. 10 years, and he was still trying to put me out a door. And then he said it, quieter, just for me, not knowing he was handing me the last piece. Go on. Go live in the streets, Adeline, like you wanted. You're embarrassing yourself. The same words. The exact same words. 10 years later, in a room full of the people he'd lied to about me. Something in me that had been waiting a very long time went perfectly still and perfectly calm. I didn't pull my arm away. I just looked at him and said, evenly, I'll leave when you've heard me out. You're going to want to hear me out, Dad. So is everyone in this room. Behind him, near the stage, I saw Trevor Pruitt notice me. I watched the color drain out of his face. He, at least, was starting to understand. The rest of them had no idea what was about to happen. Trevor got to me before my father could decide what to do. He steered me toward the side of the hall, away from the crowd, his smile stretched so tight it looked painful. He'd put the pieces together faster than the others because he was the only one with a guilty conscience to sharpen him. The investor, he said under his breath, the one who bought the note. That's you, isn't it? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He started talking fast, the way men talk when they feel the floor going. He told me we could be reasonable. He told me there was no need to make a mess in front of everyone, no need to drag the family name through this. And then he said the line I'd been half waiting for, the one that told me everything about what kind of man my sister had married. Look, we can fix this quietly. You and me. Name your number. Quietly? He wanted to fix quietly the thing he'd spent 6 years doing quietly to me. He wanted to make the truth a private transaction, because men like Trevor know that secrets are where they win, and daylight is where they lose. I looked at him, this man who had reached into my life a few $100s at a time for 6 years, and I felt the cleanest kind of calm. The funny part? The part he still didn't grasp was that he was negotiating with the one person in the room who didn't need his money or his silence. I had both. I told him I'd give him my answer in front of everyone, same as I'd give my father. Then I walked back toward the stage, and Trevor didn't follow, because there was nowhere left for him to steer me. My father, rattled but unwilling to lose his own gala, did the only thing he knew how to do. He took the stage and performed. He tapped the microphone, smiled his developer's smile, and told the room exactly what they'd come to hear. Grand Vista was not in trouble, he said. Grand Vista was on the verge of something wonderful. He'd been in talks, he said, with a major private partner, a serious investor who had quietly acquired a significant stake and who shared his vision for bringing luxury living to Hartwell. Any rumors of trouble were just that. Rumors, spread by people who didn't understand high finance. He spread his arms to the room. Your investments are safe, he said. In fact, our new partner is here tonight, ready to take this project into its next chapter. The room broke into relieved applause. The widow from the church pressed her hand to her chest. The elderly couple in the third row gripped each other's hands and smiled. My father stood up there bathing in it, the savior of Grand Vista, the man whose handshake was still good. He turned toward the side of the stage to gesture grandly at the mysterious partner he'd been promising. He fully expected some out-of-town money man in a sharp suit to walk out and shake his hand. The whole room followed his gaze, and the dramatic irony of it was almost too much, because every person in that hall was about to learn what I already knew. There was no out-of-town money man. The new partner, the one who'd bought the note, the one who held Grand Vista in the palm of her hand, was the daughter Gerald Faulkner had spent 10 years calling a failure. I stood up. The applause was still going when I walked to the front of the hall, and it died in pieces as people realized where I was headed. Not to a seat, but up the steps, onto the stage, toward the microphone my father was still holding. He stared at me. Adeline, sit down, he said, the mask cracking. This doesn't concern you. I took the microphone gently out of his hand. I didn't grab it. I just took it. And he was so stunned he let me. I turned to the room, to all those faces I'd grown up around, the ones who'd been told for 10 years that I was a cautionary tale. My name is Adeline Faulkner, I said, Most of you were told I failed. I want to introduce myself properly. I kept my voice low and even, the way you talk to a frightened animal, the way my grandmother used to talk to me. I'm the founder of Faulkner and Vale Restoration. We build senior housing. Last year we did about $15 million in business, and 3 days ago, my company became the partner my father has been promising you. You could have heard a pin drop, and then you could hear the room start to breathe again. Fast, the murmur rising. My father's face went gray. Somewhere in the third row, the elderly couple leaned forward. I let the silence do its work for a moment. Because here is the thing I understood that none of them did. The mysterious savior Gerald had invented to calm the room was real. He just couldn't have imagined that the person he'd been describing, serious, successful, holding the whole project's fate, was the child he'd locked out in the rain. He had spent 10 years telling a story about me. And now, in front of everyone he'd told it to, the story was correcting itself, line by line. My father found his voice, and it came out exactly as I knew it would. Loud. He grabbed for the microphone and missed, and then he stopped pretending there was a room at all. You think you can come in here and humiliate me after everything this family gave you? You ungrateful, scheming? He was shouting now, spit flying, the developer's smile gone, the whole town watching the real Gerald Faulkner for the first time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I set my folder on the podium and opened it, calm as a Sunday, and I let him burn himself out. When he paused for breath, I spoke into the quiet he'd left. Everything the family gave me, I repeated. Let's talk about that. I held up the first page. For 6 years, someone drained a joint account my parents opened in my name, about $40,000, a little at a time. The withdrawals were authorized by Trevor Pruitt. Heads turned to Trevor, who had gone the color of paste. I held up the second page. And here is the loan that funds Grand Vista. My company owns it now. Pledged against it, as collateral, is a 40-acre parcel my father has called Faulkner land his whole life. I held up the third page, my grandmother's deed, her careful signature, and the county recording stamp plain across the top. He doesn't own it. He never did. My grandmother signed it over to me, alone, and recorded it years ago. He borrowed millions against land that was already mine, and the title work on his refinance was too rushed to catch it. The room made a sound like a held breath letting go. My father stared at the deed, and I watched the truth land on him, the way a man's face changes when the floor he's been standing on turns out to be painted on canvas. I'm not here to take the house, Dad, I said. Still quiet, still even. I'm here so these people get to keep theirs. And for the first time in my life, in a room full of people, my father had nothing to say. I turned away from my father and spoke to the people who actually mattered in that room, the investors, the retirees, the neighbors who'd handed over their savings on the strength of a handshake. I know what most of you put into this project, I said. And I know some of you put in everything, so here's what's going to happen. I laid it out plainly, the plan I'd built. My company would take over Grand Vista. We'd scale it down from glass towers into something Hartwell actually needed and could sustain. And every single investor would be paid back in full, on a schedule, in writing, starting that month. No one was going to lose their retirement because they'd trusted the wrong Faulkner. The widow from the church put her face in her hands. The elderly couple in the third row just held onto each other and nodded, over and over. That was when Trevor, desperate, pushed up out of his seat. Adeline, come on, he called out, going for reasonable in front of the whole room now that quiet had failed him. We can still fix this quietly. I looked at him across all those heads, and I gave him his own words back, finally, the way I'd been saving them. No, Trevor, we don't fix this quietly. We fix it honestly, out loud. The hall was dead silent, and then somebody near the back started to clap, and then it spread, not the relieved applause my father had conducted, but something rougher and more real, the sound of a town that had just watched the truth walk in and pay everyone back. I stood on that stage holding my grandmother's deed, and I thought, this is what she meant. the only kind of rich that holds. The collapse, when it came, was quiet and total. The way these things are once the air goes out of them. Trevor's authorized withdrawals were exactly the kind of thing that does not survive daylight. Within a month he was facing a civil investigation, and the money he'd skimmed from my account was the least of his problems, because once people start looking at a man like Trevor, they find all the other accounts too. Vanessa's perfect life turned out to be held up by the same missing money. The cars were leased, the house was mortgaged twice, and the lifestyle she'd protected so fiercely had been running on what her husband stole. She left Hartwell within weeks. I heard she moved 2 states away, where nobody knew the name. My father kept his house. I made sure of that. Not for him, but because my mother lived in it, and because taking it would have made me into the thing he always said I was. But Grand Vista was no longer his. The billboards came down. The man whose handshake had been good in Hartwell for 40 years was, very suddenly, just an old man who'd borrowed against land he didn't own. And the strangest part, the part I didn't expect, was the town itself turning. The same women in the diner who'd called me a drain on the state now told the story differently. The Faulkner girl, they said. The one who came back and paid everybody. The one who dug in the dirt and built something real. The story they'd built out of lies for 10 years had finally been replaced by the truth. And the truth, it turned out, had my name on it the whole time. My father found me in the parking lot afterward, while people were still filing out into the dark. He looked smaller than the billboards. For a moment I thought he might finally say it, the thing I'd waited 10 years to hear. Instead, he asked the only question a man like him knows how to ask. "So what now?" he said. "Do you forgive me? Or not?" Not sorry. Not even close to sorry. Just a man asking whether the account between us could be marked paid so he could stop feeling the weight of it. I thought about the porch light. I thought about the deadbolt, and the envelope my mother never got to hand me, and the $2,000 in 10s and 20s, and 40 acres of my grandmother's careful ink. And I gave him the truest answer I had. "You told me to go live in the streets," I said. "So I went, and I built homes on them." I didn't say it to wound him. I said it because it was simply, finally, true. Then I got in my car, my own car, in my own name, and I drove the 2 hours back to Calderon, back to my actual home, and I did not look in the mirror once. Forgiveness, I've come to think, isn't a gift you hand someone so they can feel lighter. Sometimes it's just deciding you're done carrying the weight in the first place. I was done. I'd set it all down on that stage, in front of everyone. The way you set down something you've been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't part of you. My hands, for the first time in 10 years, were empty and free. We broke ground on the 40 acres the following spring. Not glass towers. A senior community, the kind I'd been building for 10 years, the kind Ruth and her friends could actually live in. We called it Marin's Place. And we put my grandmother's name over the door in plain letters, and on opening day I stood in the lobby and could almost hear her gravel laugh. The Grand Vista investors got their money back, every one of them, on the schedule I'd promised. The widow from the church sent me a card with a pressed flower in it. The elderly couple from the 3rd row moved into one of the first units at Marin's Place, and the husband shakes my hand every time he sees me, like it still surprises him that someone kept their word. My mother wrote me a letter that summer, a real one, in her own hand. It wasn't an apology, Carol Faulkner doesn't have one of those in her, but it was honest, and it asked, carefully, if I might ever come for coffee. I haven't, not yet. But I didn't throw the letter away either. I keep it in the steel box, next to my grandmother's deed. Some doors you don't lock and you don't walk through. You just leave them where they are and let them mean what they mean. As for Vanessa and Trevor, I don't hear from them, and I've made my peace with that. They built their lives on appearances and missing money, and when both ran out, there was nothing underneath. I built mine on rotted siding and a paint can label and a promise to keep people warm. One of those foundations holds. The other was always just painted on canvas. Here's what I know now. After all of it, worth isn't something your family hands you across a dinner table, and it isn't something they can take back by turning off a porch light. You build it quietly, board by board, year by year, until one day the people who locked the door are the ones standing outside it, knocking. That's where I'll leave Addie. Keys in her pocket, porch light on, this time by her own hand. A locked door at 24. A signed deed at 34. A grandmother's $2,000 that started it all. If someone ever underestimated the quiet one in your family, share this story with her tonight. Tell me her name in the comments, and subscribe to Calm Drama Stories, because the next quiet woman is just getting started.